Hello guys and welcome back to EasyPy3. In this lesson you will learn the three basic data types in Python and how to convert each of them. Just to note, I will continue to use the Python shell throughout the course for a demonstration purpose. You can use it too for testing things you learn, but remember guys, if you use the shell you can't save your work. So if you're looking to save your work, make sure you create a new file and write your code in there. So you should already be aware of the term string from your first code lesson. We said that hello world was a string. In reality, any text inside quote marks is called a string, which is shortened to str in Python. Let's introduce you to another type of data called integer, which is shortened to int. An integer is a whole number. It can be negative or positive. Pay attention to the screen on the right. You'll see when we print string 42, we get 42. And when we print an integer 42, we get 42. Although strings and integers can seem the same, they aren't. A string 42 isn't the same as an integer 42 in Python. In the computer's memory, these two values are stored completely differently. Therefore, there are limitations in the way we can use both, which you will learn about later in this course. Let's look at how to write integers in Python. But before that, I just want to point out that you can use the shell without using the print function. So if I just go over here and write 42 and press enter, it'll return 42. That's because the shell is always ready to print something or evaluate something or calculate something. Okay, now if I told you to pick up a pen and write 42 million, you would either write it with spaces or commas or dots. But none of these formats are allowed in Python. There are only two ways to write integers in Python. First is to write it without any spaces. And the second is to use underscore, which makes the code easier to read. The same is true for a negative number, but you just have to put a minus sign before it. As a side point, you can put a plus sign before a positive number, but it's redundant. It's now time to introduce you to another data type called float. A float is short for floating point, which is a number that has a fractional part. It can also be positive or negative. Once again, an integer may seem the same as a float to us. For example, 1 and 1.0, we know that that's the same thing, but in Python it isn't. 1 is an integer and 1.0 is a float. Therefore, the computer stores it differently. Even if we write 1 point instead of 1, it will store it as a float. So it's the decimal point that makes a float, like the quote marks make a string. Another thing that gives floats is the exponential function, which is usually on your calculator as exp button. It's the same as 10 to the power of, and in Python you can use lowercase or uppercase e for it. The value after the e, the exponent, has to be an integer. In other words, a whole number which can be positive or negative. On the other hand, the base, which is the value before e, can either be an integer or a float. The final thing I want you to learn in this lesson is data type casting, which is a way to convert data types. There are two types of conversions in Python. The first is called implicit or automatic conversion. An example of this is if we add an integer and a float, Python will automatically put the result in floats to ensure no data is lost. The second type is called explicit or casting. This is when we decide to change the data type using a function. However, some data can be lost. There are three built-in casting functions in Python. The first is the int function, int function. Whatever you want to convert goes inside the brackets. So this function allows you to convert a string into integer, as long as the string only contains a number. It also lets you convert floats into integer, but rounds down to the nearest whole number, even if the float is 0.9. So if you had 4.9, it would take it down to 4. Thus, you have a loss of data. The second function is float. This lets you convert integers to floats and string to float as long as the string is either a whole number or a float. The last casting function is string or str. This lets you convert any integer or float into a string. Finally, there's another useful function called type, and this allows you to check the data type of any given value. Okay, so we've covered a lot of things in this lesson which are foundational. If you don't understand something, go over it. Remember, you can always use the Python shell to try the things you've learnt. Next up is a short quiz on this lesson, so do that when you're ready.